I never imagined that the deepest wounds would come from the person I once called my partner, the father of my children, the man I built my life around. My name is Margaret, and today I need to tell you what happened to me, because I refuse to let this story die in silence. The words that shattered my world still echo in my mind. "You're just a housewife. You wouldn't survive a day without me." He said it with such cold indifference, such casual cruelty, that for a moment I thought I had misheard. But the laughter that followed, his laughter, mixed with the mocking giggles of our children, confirmed that this was my new reality. I stood there in the kitchen where I had spent decades nurturing, comforting, and loving, feeling my soul leave my body. My hands, the same hands that had cooked thousands of meals, wiped away countless tears, and built every corner of this home, began to tremble. I looked at my family, my husband smirking with satisfaction, my children rolling their eyes as if I were some embarrassing relic, and realized I had become invisible in my own life. The humiliation didn't end there. It became a daily ritual, a sport they seemed to enjoy. At dinner parties, he would introduce me as the one who keeps the house running, and the conversation would immediately move on, leaving me stranded like a piece of furniture. His friends would look at me with a mixture of pity and superiority, as if I were some relic of a bygone era. I would smile politely, laugh at the right moments, but inside, my heart was breaking with the knowledge that I was being erased, one dismissive comment at a time. My husband would brag about his business deals, his risks, his successes, and then add, almost as an afterthought, "Margaret just takes care of things at home. She wouldn't last a day in my world." The laughter that followed was always sharp, always at my expense. Our children, desperate for his approval, joined in eagerly. I tried to remind myself that I was the one who taught them how to tie their shoes, how to read, how to be kind. But their gratitude had vanished, replaced by a cold indifference that chilled me to the bone. I began to question my own reality. Was I truly as insignificant as they made me feel? I started avoiding mirrors, unable to face the woman I had become. The lines on my face told the story of sleepless nights, silent tears, dreams deferred and hopes abandoned. I remembered the girl I once was, full of promise, eager to conquer the world, and wondered where she had gone. Every morning I woke up before everyone else, prepared breakfast, ironed shirts, organized schedules, made sure every detail of their lives ran smoothly. But none of that mattered. My husband would come home late, smelling of expensive cologne, throw his jacket on the floor, and expect me to pick it up without a word. If I hesitated, even for a second, he would glare at me with that look of disappointment, as if I were failing at the only thing I was supposedly good for. The worst moment came one evening when I overheard him on the phone, laughing with his friends about how he could replace me in a heartbeat. He said I was lucky he kept me around, that no one else would put up with someone so simple. My heart pounded in my chest, each word a blow I couldn't dodge. I pressed my hand to my mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to escape, my body shaking with the effort to remain unseen, unheard, unimportant. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of my marriage. The promises he made, the vows we exchanged, the dreams we once shared, all of it felt like a cruel joke now. I realized with burning clarity that I had become a stranger in my own home, a ghost haunting the rooms I had once filled with laughter and love. But in that darkness, something began to stir, a spark of defiance, faint but growing stronger. I refused to believe that my worth could be measured by their indifference. Deep down, I knew this was not the end of my story. I was more than their servant, more than their punchline, more than just a housewife. I was Margaret, and one day they would remember my name. Before I became invisible, before I was reduced to nothing more than a label, I was someone. I was Margaret Thompson, a woman with dreams, ambitions, and a heart full of hope. I need you to understand who I was before they tried to erase me, because that woman, the real me, never truly disappeared. She was just buried under years of sacrifice and selfless love. I met David when I was 25, fresh out of college with a degree in business administration and a fire in my belly that could have moved mountains. I had just landed my first job at a marketing firm, and I was determined to climb every ladder, break every ceiling, and prove that I could succeed in a man's world. I was ambitious, confident, and absolutely certain that I could have it all. David was charming, successful, and he seemed to admire my drive. He would tell me how impressed he was by my intelligence, how he loved that I wasn't like other women who only cared about marriage and babies. Those early years were magical. We were partners in every sense of the word. I helped him build his first business, working late nights by his side, contributing ideas, making connections, and believing wholeheartedly in our shared future. When he landed his first major contract, he credited me publicly, telling everyone how I had been instrumental in his success. I felt valued, appreciated, essential. We were a team, and I thought we always would be. When I became pregnant with our first child, Sarah, David was overjoyed. He promised me that nothing would change, that we would find a way to balance everything. But as my pregnancy progressed, subtle shifts began to occur. He started making decisions without consulting me, dismissing my input as pregnancy hormones. When I suggested hiring help so I could return to work after the baby, he laughed and said, "Why would we pay someone else when you can do it better? Besides, what's more important than raising our child?" I convinced myself he was right. What could be more important than nurturing the life we had created together? I took maternity leave, planning to return after a few months, but those months stretched into years. David's business grew, demanding more of his time and attention. He traveled frequently, worked long hours, and gradually, I found myself managing everything at home. The children, we had 3 and 5 years, became my world, my responsibility, my identity. I threw myself into motherhood with the same passion I had once reserved for my career. I researched the best schools, organized playdates, volunteered for every committee, and made sure our home was a sanctuary of love and warmth. I told myself I was building something important, something lasting. I was creating the foundation upon which our family would thrive. David would come home exhausted from his business trips and find everything perfectly organized, the children happy and well cared for, dinner waiting on the table. He would smile and say, "I don't know how you do it all," and I would glow with pride. But somewhere along the way, appreciation turned into expectation. The compliments became fewer, the acknowledgments rarer. When David's business really took off and we moved to a bigger house in a better neighborhood, I felt like we were living the dream. I decorated every room with love, created spaces where memories could be made, and continued to pour my heart into making our house a home. I organized dinner parties for David's clients, always making sure I looked perfect, that the food was exquisite, that every detail reflected well on his success. I remember one particular evening when David's biggest client complimented him on having such a perfect wife. David beamed and said, "She's amazing. I couldn't do any of this without her." I felt a surge of pride, of validation. I was contributing, I was valuable, I was seen. But as the years passed, those moments of recognition became increasingly rare, replaced by a growing sense that my contributions were simply expected, unremarkable, invisible. I started to notice how David's tone changed when he spoke about his work versus when he spoke about mine. His voice would light up with excitement when he talked about deals and meetings and challenges. But when friends asked what I did, he would say, "Margaret takes care of the home front," in a tone that suggested it was simple, easy, unimportant. I began to feel like I was shrinking, becoming smaller and less significant with each passing day. The children grew older and more independent, but instead of giving me freedom, it seemed to highlight how little I had to show for all those years. David's achievements were visible, measurable, celebrated. Mine were invisible, taken for granted, dismissed. I had given up my career, my ambitions, my identity, believing I was investing in something greater. But now I wondered if I had simply made myself dispensable. I tried to reclaim some of my former self. I suggested going back to work, maybe starting my own business, but David would laugh and say, "Why would you want to stress yourself with that? You have everything you need right here." The children, now teenagers, seemed embarrassed by the idea of their mother working, as if it would somehow diminish their status among their friends. I realized I had become exactly what I never wanted to be, completely dependent, entirely defined by my relationships to others, with no identity of my own. The woman who once believed she could conquer the world had been replaced by someone whose greatest achievement was keeping everyone else happy. And the most heartbreaking part was that I had done it all willingly, lovingly, believing it was what a good wife and mother should do. But that woman, the ambitious, confident, capable woman I once was still there, buried beneath years of self-sacrifice. She was waiting, watching, remembering what it felt like to be valued for her mind, her skills, her contributions. She was about to remind everyone, including myself, that she had never really gone away. The change didn't happen overnight. It crept in slowly, like poison seeping through cracks I didn't even know existed. At first I told myself I was imagining things, that the small slights and dismissive comments were just stress, just temporary rough patches in our otherwise solid marriage. But looking back now, I can see exactly when the respect began to erode, when my family started to see me not as a person, but as a service they were entitled to receive. It started with the little things. David stopped saying thank you when I brought him his morning coffee, exactly how he liked it, at exactly the right temperature. He stopped noticing when I wore something new or got my hair done. When I would mention something that happened during my day, a conversation with a neighbor, a problem I had solved, a small victory I had achieved, his eyes would glaze over and he would change the subject to something more important. I began to feel like I was talking to a wall, my words bouncing back unheard, unacknowledged, unimportant. The children followed his lead, as children often do. Sarah, my eldest, who used to run to me with every scraped knee and broken heart, started going to her father instead. When I would offer advice or try to help with homework, she would sigh dramatically and say, "Dad already explained it better." My son Michael began to dismiss my opinions with a wave of his hand, saying things like, "Mom, you don't understand how the real world works." Even my youngest, Emma, who had always been my shadow, started to treat me like an inconvenience, rolling her eyes when I asked about her day or tried to engage in conversation. The first time David openly mocked me in front of the children, I was so shocked I couldn't respond. We were at the dinner table, and I was sharing something I had read in the news, trying to contribute to the conversation. David interrupted me mid-sentence and said, "Margaret, stick to what you know. Leave the important stuff to people who actually understand it." The children giggled, and I felt my face burn with humiliation. I tried to laugh it off, to pretend it didn't hurt, but something inside me cracked that night. Family gatherings became exercises in endurance. David's parents, who had once treated me with warmth and respect, began to make subtle comments about how easy my life was, how lucky I was to not have to work. His mother would make pointed remarks about women who contributed more to their families, always with a sweet smile that didn't reach her eyes. His father would joke about how I had hit the jackpot by marrying David, as if I were some gold digger who had trapped their precious son. The worst part was how David not only allowed these comments, but encouraged them. He would laugh along, adding his own observations about my simple life, my limited understanding of complex matters. I watched as the people I loved most turned me into a punchline, a source of amusement, a person whose feelings didn't matter, because I wasn't really a person at all, just a role, just a function, just the wife. I started to notice how differently I was treated when David wasn't around versus when he was present. Alone with friends or neighbors, I could hold intelligent conversations, offer valuable insights, and be treated as an equal. But the moment David appeared, I would watch as their attention shifted to him, as my words became background noise, as I faded into invisibility. It was as if his presence somehow diminished mine, as if there wasn't room for both of us to exist in the same space. The isolation began to set in. Friends stopped calling as frequently, perhaps sensing the tension in my marriage or simply losing interest in someone who seemed to have nothing new or exciting to share. I had become boring, predictable, safe, all the things I had once sworn I would never be. My world had shrunk to the size of our house, my concerns limited to grocery lists and school schedules, my conversations reduced to logistics and pleasantries. I tried to fight back, to reclaim some space for myself. I suggested we take a vacation together, just the two of us, to reconnect and remember why we fell in love. David's response was swift and cutting. "What would we talk about? You don't have anything interesting to say anymore." The words hit me like a physical blow, leaving me breathless and reeling. I realized that in his eyes, I had become not just boring, but burdensome, a weight he had to carry rather than a partner he chose to love. The children's attitudes grew worse as they entered their teenage years. They began to see me through their father's eyes, as someone whose opinions didn't matter, whose feelings were inconsequential, whose very presence was somehow embarrassing. They would make plans without including me, have conversations that stopped when I entered the room, and treat me like a servant whose only purpose was to meet their needs. I remember one particularly painful evening when we were having dinner with David's business associates. I had spent all day preparing, making sure everything was perfect. During the meal, I tried to contribute to the conversation about market trends, drawing on knowledge I had gained from my college studies and years of reading business publications. David cut me off with a patronizing smile and said, "Honey, why don't you check on dessert? Leave the business talk to us." The humiliation was complete when his colleagues chuckled and one of them said, "Lucky you, David. A wife who knows her place." That night, lying in bed next to a man who had once promised to love and cherish me, I felt more alone than I ever had in my life. I realized that I had become a stranger to myself, that in trying to be the perfect wife and mother, I had lost the essence of who I was. The confident, capable woman I once was seemed like a distant memory, a character from someone else's story. But even in that darkness, a small voice inside me whispered that this wasn't the end, that the woman they were trying to erase was stronger than they knew, smarter than they gave her credit for, and far more capable than they could imagine. They had made a crucial mistake in underestimating me, and soon, very soon, they would learn just how wrong they had been. The contempt that had started as subtle dismissals and casual slights began to escalate into something far more cruel and deliberate. What had once been thoughtless comments became calculated attacks designed to remind me of my place, to keep me small, to ensure I never forgot that I was nothing more than an accessory to their lives. The family I had devoted my entire existence to had turned into my tormentors, and the home I had built with love had become a prison of humiliation. David's business continued to thrive, and with success came arrogance. He began to treat me not just as irrelevant, but as an active embarrassment. At social events, he would introduce me with phrases like, "This is my wife, she doesn't work," emphasizing the word "doesn't" as if it were a character flaw. When people asked what I did, he would answer for me before I could speak. "Margaret keeps busy with little household things. Nothing too complicated." The laughter that followed these introductions was always at my expense, and I could see the pity in people's eyes as they looked at me, the poor, simple housewife who couldn't possibly understand the complexities of the real world. The children's behavior became increasingly cruel. Sarah, now in college, would bring friends home and introduce me as just my mom, as if I were some generic figure rather than the woman who had sacrificed everything for her happiness. She would tell stories about her successful father and his important work, but when asked about me, she would shrug and say, "Mom just does mom stuff." The casual dismissal in her voice cut deeper than any deliberate insult could have. Michael, my son, began to openly challenge my authority and intelligence. When I would try to help with college applications or offer advice about his future, he would say things like, "Mom, you've never had a real job. You don't understand how the world works." He started bringing girlfriends home who would look at me with barely concealed disdain, as if I were some cautionary tale of what happens when women don't have ambition. I overheard one of them say to Michael, "I would never end up like your mom. I actually have goals." Emma, my youngest, who had once been my closest companion, began to treat me like hired help. She would leave messes for me to clean, demand that I drive her places without so much as a please or thank you, and speak to me in a tone she would never dare use with her father. When her friends came over, she would act embarrassed by my presence, quickly ushering them to her room as if I were something shameful to be hidden away. The financial humiliation was perhaps the worst part. David had always handled our finances, and I had trusted him completely. But as his contempt grew, he began to use money as a weapon. He would question every purchase I made, no matter how small or necessary. "Do you really need that?" became his standard response to any request for household items or personal necessities. He started giving me an allowance, like I was a child, forcing me to justify every expense, to beg for money to buy groceries or replace worn-out clothes. When I suggested getting a part-time job to have some financial independence, his reaction was swift and brutal. "Who would hire you?" he laughed. "You have no skills, no experience, No connections. You've been out of the workforce for so long, you're unemployable. Besides, what would people think if my wife had to work? It would look like I can't provide for my family. The message was clear. I was trapped, dependent, powerless. The social isolation became complete. David stopped including me in business dinners and important events, claiming I would be bored or out of place. When I protested, he would say, "These are serious business discussions. You wouldn't understand." I was relegated to women's luncheons and charity events where I was expected to smile, nod, and write checks from David's account while contributing nothing of substance to any conversation. The psychological warfare was relentless. David began to forget important dates, my birthday, our anniversary, holidays that had once been special to us. When I would remind him, he would act surprised and say, "Oh, was that today? I've been so busy with important things." The children followed suit, treating these occasions as inconveniences rather than celebrations. I found myself spending my birthday alone, my anniversary ignored, my achievements, however small, completely overlooked. The most devastating blow came during a family dinner when David's brother visited with his wife, a successful lawyer. As we sat around the table I had set with care, using china I had selected and food I had prepared, the conversation turned to career achievements and professional goals. David's sister-in-law spoke passionately about a case she was working on, and everyone listened with rapt attention. When she finished, David's brother said, "It's so inspiring to see women making a real difference in the world." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt every eye at the table turn to me, and I could see the unspoken comparison being made. Finally, David broke the silence with a laugh that chilled me to the bone. "Well, Margaret has certainly made a difference too. Our house has never been cleaner." The laughter that erupted around the table was like a physical assault. I excused myself to the kitchen, where I stood gripping the counter, fighting back tears of rage and humiliation. That night, as I lay in bed listening to David's satisfied snoring, I realized that I had become a cautionary tale, an example of what happens when a woman gives up everything for others. I was the punchline to jokes I wasn't even present to hear, the subject of pitying conversations among women who had made different choices. I had become everything I had once sworn I would never be: invisible, voiceless, powerless. But in that darkness, something fundamental shifted inside me. The humiliation that was meant to break me began to forge something harder, stronger, more dangerous than they could possibly imagine. They had pushed me too far, taken too much, assumed I would simply accept their cruelty forever. They were about to learn that the woman they had tried so hard to erase was still very much alive, and she was done being their victim. The final blow came on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, but ended with the complete destruction of everything I thought I knew about my life. I had been married to David for 22 years, had given him 3 children, had sacrificed my career, my dreams, my very identity to build the life he wanted. I thought I had reached the bottom of humiliation, that there was no deeper level of contempt they could show me. I was wrong. It began with a phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. I was in the kitchen, as always, preparing David's breakfast exactly the way he liked it when his phone rang in the living room. He was in the shower, so I called out that I would take a message, but he shouted back, "Don't touch my phone, just let it ring." The urgency in his voice made me pause, and when the phone rang again immediately, curiosity got the better of me. I glanced at the screen and saw a name I didn't recognize. Jennifer. Office. Something cold settled in my stomach. David had never mentioned anyone named Jennifer, and the way he had reacted to the phone call felt wrong, secretive. When he came downstairs, I mentioned the calls casually, watching his face carefully. He barely looked at me as he said, "Just business stuff. Nothing you would understand." But I saw the flash of something in his eyes. Guilt, perhaps, or fear. For the first time in years, I felt truly awake, alert, suspicious. That afternoon, while David was at work and the children were at school, I did something I had never done before. I went through his things. I felt like a stranger in my own home as I searched his office, his dresser, his car. What I found shattered the last remnants of the life I thought I was living. Credit card statements showing expensive dinners for 2 at restaurants I had never been to. Hotel receipts from business trips where he had supposedly traveled alone. And then, the final piece of evidence that destroyed me completely. A jewelry receipt for a diamond necklace that cost more than we spent on household expenses in 6 months. A necklace I had never seen, never received, never even known existed. When David came home that evening, I confronted him with the evidence spread across the kitchen table like a prosecutor presenting a case. His reaction was not shame, not remorse, not even surprise. It was annoyance. "You went through my private things?" he said, his voice cold with disgust. "What kind of wife spies on her husband?" I stared at him in disbelief, waiting for an explanation, an apology, something that would make sense of what I had discovered. Instead, he picked up the receipts and said, "This is exactly why I don't discuss business with you. You wouldn't understand the complexities of client relationships." Client relationships, that's what he called it. 22 years of marriage, and he was calling his affair a client relationship. I felt something break inside me, something that could never be repaired. "David," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "how long has this been going on?" His answer was delivered with the casual cruelty of someone swatting a fly. "Does it matter? It's not like our marriage has been real for years anyway. You're just here, like furniture. At least Jennifer appreciates what I've accomplished." The children came home in the middle of our confrontation, and instead of supporting me, instead of being shocked by their father's betrayal, they seemed annoyed by the disruption. Sarah looked at the papers scattered on the table and said, "God, Mom, are you having some kind of breakdown? Dad works hard. He deserves to have some fun." Michael nodded in agreement. "Yeah, Mom, you're being really dramatic. It's not like you guys have been happy for years anyway." Emma, my baby, the child I had held through countless nights, looked at me with something approaching disgust and said, "This is so embarrassing. Can't you just handle this privately?" I realized in that moment that I was completely alone. The family I had devoted my life to had not only abandoned me, but had turned against me. I was the problem, the embarrassment, the one causing unnecessary drama by objecting to my husband's infidelity. I was expected to accept this betrayal quietly, gracefully, invisibly, just as I had accepted everything else. But the worst was yet to come. The next morning, David sat me down with a cup of coffee and a folder full of papers. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone businesslike and cold, "and I think it's time we made some changes. This house is too big for what we need, and frankly, we could use the money from selling it for other investments." I stared at him, not understanding. "What are you saying?" I asked. His smile was the cruelest thing I had ever seen. "I'm saying we're selling the house, Margaret. I've already spoken to a realtor, and I think it would be best if you found somewhere else to live. The children are grown. They don't need you anymore, and honestly, neither do I." He was throwing me out. After 22 years of marriage, after sacrificing everything for his success and his happiness, after giving him my youth, my dreams, my entire identity, he was discarding me like garbage. "You can't be serious," I whispered. But the legal papers he slid across the table told me he was deadly serious. Divorce papers, already filed, already in motion. I was being erased from my own life with the efficiency of a business transaction. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked, my voice breaking. "What am I supposed to do?" His response was delivered without a trace of emotion. "That's not my problem anymore, Margaret. You should have thought about that before you let yourself become so useless. Maybe this will motivate you to finally do something with your life." The children's reactions were even worse than David's cruelty. They were relieved. Sarah actually said, "Finally, maybe now we can have some peace around here." Michael was already making plans for his friends to use the house before it sold. Emma was excited about redecorating her room in whatever new place David would buy. None of them seemed to care where I would go or how I would survive. I had become so invisible to them that my disappearance was not a loss, but a convenience. That night, sitting alone in the house I had made into a home, surrounded by the life I had built with love and devotion, I felt something die inside me. But something else was being born, something harder, colder, more determined than the woman who had spent decades being grateful for scraps of affection. They had made a fatal mistake in assuming I was weak, that I was helpless, that I was nothing without them. They were about to discover just how wrong they were. The woman they had tried to destroy was about to rise from the ashes of their cruelty, and when she did, they would learn that underestimating someone who has nothing left to lose is the most dangerous mistake of all. What they didn't know What they could never have imagined in their arrogance and contempt was that I had been preparing for this moment for years. While they saw me as nothing more than a simple housewife, while they dismissed me as someone who wouldn't last a day in the real world, I had been quietly, methodically, brilliantly planning for the day when their cruelty would finally cross the line. You see, I may have given up my career to raise our children, but I never stopped being the intelligent, strategic woman who had once helped David build his first business. While he was out conquering the world and taking all the credit, I was home doing more than just cooking and cleaning. I was watching, learning, and most importantly, planning. 3 years ago, when David's dismissive comments began to escalate into outright cruelty, I made a decision that would change everything. I started documenting everything, every insult, every affair, every financial decision, every business move. But more than that, I began to take action. I opened my own bank account, something David never knew about, using my maiden name and an address he had never seen. My real stroke of genius came when I remembered something from my college days, something about business law and corporate structures that David had long forgotten I knew. I began to research, to study, to understand the intricate web of his business empire. What I discovered was both shocking and incredibly useful. David's company, the source of all his pride and arrogance, was built on a foundation that was far more fragile than anyone realized. I spent months learning about his business partners, his investors, his clients. I discovered debts he had hidden, contracts he had signed carelessly, and most importantly, legal vulnerabilities he had never bothered to address because he was too busy believing his own hype. While he was out having expensive dinners with Jennifer, I was quietly meeting with lawyers, accountants, and business consultants. The most beautiful part of my plan was how I used David's own arrogance against him. He was so convinced of my incompetence that he never bothered to hide anything from me. Important documents were left on his desk, passwords were never changed, business calls were taken in my presence. He treated me like furniture, and furniture, as everyone knows, sees everything but is never suspected of understanding what it observes. I discovered that David had been using our joint assets as collateral for risky business ventures without my knowledge or consent. Legally, this was problematic for him, but it was an opportunity for me. I quietly hired the best divorce attorney in the state, a woman who specialized in cases involving hidden assets and financial deception. But I didn't stop there. I began to invest the money I had saved, using knowledge I had gained from years of listening to David's business conversations. I bought stocks in companies I knew were about to announce major deals, invested in properties in areas I knew were about to be developed, and most cleverly of all, I began to purchase shares in David's own company through shell corporations that couldn't be traced back to me. The children, who had been so cruel in their dismissal of my intelligence, had no idea that their simple mother was quietly building a financial empire that would soon dwarf their father's achievements. While they were laughing at my easy life, I was working 18-hour days, learning, planning, and positioning myself for the moment when I would reveal the truth about who I really was. I also began to document David's affair with Jennifer, hiring a private investigator to gather evidence that would be useful in divorce proceedings. But more than that, I discovered that Jennifer wasn't just David's mistress. She was also embezzling money from his company. This information became another weapon in my arsenal, another card I could play when the time was right. While David was telling everyone that I wouldn't last a day in the business world, I was already succeeding in it. I was earning my own money, building my own reputation, and creating my own network of professional relationships. The woman he thought he had destroyed was not only alive, but thriving in ways he couldn't imagine. As I sat in that kitchen on the morning David told me he was throwing me out, as I listened to him explain how useless and worthless I was, I felt a calm satisfaction wash over me. He had no idea that the woman he was discarding had already secured her own future, had already built her own success, and had already set in motion events that would soon turn his world upside down. The weeks following David's announcement that he was throwing me out were perhaps the most surreal of my entire life. While I was secretly putting the final pieces of my plan into motion, while I was meeting with lawyers and finalizing arrangements that would change everything, my family continued to treat me with the same casual cruelty they had perfected over the years. David moved through the house with a spring in his step, clearly relieved to have finally taken action to remove what he saw as dead weight from his life. He would whistle while getting dressed in the morning, hum while reading his newspaper, and smile with genuine happiness in a way I hadn't seen in years. The prospect of being free from his useless wife had given him a new lease on life. He began to make plans openly, discussing with the children how much better their lives would be once I was gone. "We'll get a smaller place," he would say over dinner, "something modern and efficient. No more of your mother's clutter and unnecessary decorations." The children would nod enthusiastically, as if the home I had created with love and care was nothing more than an inconvenience they had been forced to endure. Jennifer became a more frequent presence in our house, though David was careful to introduce her as a business associate when neighbors were around. I watched as she walked through my home, evaluating my furniture, my artwork, my personal belongings with the calculating eye of someone who was already planning to replace everything. The children seemed to adore her, drawn to her youth, her career success, and most of all, her obvious disdain for me. "Jennifer is so accomplished," Sarah would gush after one of these visits. "She really understands the business world. It's refreshing to have someone around who can actually contribute to intelligent conversations." The implication was clear. I was neither accomplished nor intelligent, and my absence would be an improvement for everyone. The cruelest part was how they began to discuss my future as if I weren't there, as if I were already gone. David would speculate about where I might end up living, usually suggesting small apartments in less desirable neighborhoods. "She'll probably have to get some kind of simple job," he would muse, "maybe retail or food service, something that doesn't require too much skill or intelligence." What they didn't know was that while they were planning my downfall, I was finalizing arrangements that would secure my triumph. Every morning, after they left for work and school, I would transform from the meek housewife they thought they knew into the strategic businesswoman I had always been. My lawyer, Patricia Morrison, was a formidable woman who specialized in complex divorce cases involving hidden assets and financial deception. She had been amazed by the thoroughness of my preparation and the strength of my case. "In 30 years of practice," she told me, "I've never seen someone so well prepared for this kind of situation. Your husband has no idea what's about to hit him." I also finalized my business arrangements during this time. The consulting work I had been doing in secret had led to several lucrative contracts, and I was earning more money in a month than David gave me for household expenses in 6 months. Most satisfying of all, I completed the purchase of a controlling interest in David's own company. Through a series of shell corporations and strategic investments, I now owned more shares in Thompson Industries than David himself. The private investigator I had hired delivered his final report during this period, and it was even more damaging than I had hoped. Not only did he have extensive documentation of David's affair with Jennifer, but he had also uncovered evidence of her embezzlement from the company. The financial records showed a pattern of theft that had been going on for over a year. As the date for my eviction approached, I felt a strange sense of peace. While my family continued to mock me, dismiss me, and plan for my disappearance, I was quietly preparing to reveal the truth about who I really was and what I was really capable of. They thought they were getting rid of a burden, but they were actually about to lose everything they thought they owned. The morning that would change everything started like any other, with me preparing breakfast for a family that had grown accustomed to treating me like invisible help. What they didn't know was that this would be the last morning they would ever take me for granted. The legal papers I had been waiting for were scheduled to be delivered that day, and by evening, their entire world would be turned upside down. The first delivery came at 10 o'clock. David was in his office taking what he assumed was an important business call when the doorbell rang. I answered it myself, accepting the thick envelope from the process server with a steady hand. David emerged from his office looking annoyed at the interruption. "What's that?" he asked dismissively, barely glancing at the official-looking documents in my hands. "Some kind of charity thing? Just throw it away." His casual arrogance was perfect, exactly what I had been counting on. I smiled and said simply, "I think you should read this, David. It's addressed to both of us." The change in his expression as he read the first page was everything I had hoped for and more. The color drained from his face, his hands began to tremble, and for the first time in years, he looked at me, really looked at me, as if he were seeing a stranger. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What have you done?" What he was reading was a comprehensive legal filing that detailed every aspect of our financial life, every hidden asset, every questionable business practice, and every lie he had told over the years. The divorce papers were just the beginning. Attached were documents showing my ownership of controlling interest in his company, evidence of his affair and Jennifer's embezzlement, and a detailed accounting of every asset we owned. "I've done what any intelligent businesswoman would do," I replied calmly. "I've protected my interests and secured my future, something you assumed I was too stupid to accomplish." The look of shock on his face was worth every moment of humiliation I had endured over the years. The second wave of revelations came when David frantically called his lawyer, only to discover that his legal representation had a conflict of interest. They had been representing me for the past 6 months. His accountant was similarly compromised, having provided me with detailed financial records that David had assumed were confidential. But the real shock came when he called his office and discovered that he was locked out of his own company. As the majority shareholder, I had exercised my legal right to remove him from his position as CEO, effective immediately. Security had been instructed not to allow him on the premises, and his access to company accounts had been terminated. Jennifer's reaction was even more satisfying than David's. When she arrived at the house that afternoon, expecting to find David preparing for our divorce proceedings, she instead found him sitting in stunned silence, surrounded by legal documents that detailed not only the end of his marriage, but the end of his career and financial security. "You can't do this," she said to me, her voice shaking with fear and rage. "You're just a housewife. You don't understand business or legal matters." I smiled at her with the same condescending expression she had used on me so many times. "Actually, Jennifer, I understand them quite well enough to know that embezzling money from a company is a federal crime." The children's return from school provided the final act of this dramatic day. They walked into a house where their father sat defeated and their mother stood transformed. Sarah was the first to grasp the magnitude of what had happened. "This can't be legal," she said, her voice rising with panic. "Dad built that company. You can't just take it away from him." "I didn't take anything," I replied calmly. "I bought it, with money I earned through investments and consulting work that you all assumed I was too simple to understand. Your father made the mistake of underestimating me, and now he's paying the price for that arrogance." That evening, as my family sat in stunned silence, trying to process the complete reversal of their fortunes, I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything I had experienced in decades. The woman they had tried to erase had not only survived, but had triumphed in ways they never thought possible. The aftermath of that revelatory day unfolded exactly as I had planned. But even I was surprised by how completely and thoroughly my family's world collapsed. What I had orchestrated was not just a divorce or a business takeover. It was a complete reversal of power that left them scrambling to understand how the woman they had dismissed as worthless had become the architect of their downfall. David's attempts to fight the legal proceedings were pathetic and desperate. He hired lawyer after lawyer, each one telling him the same thing. I had been meticulous in my preparation, and every action I had taken was completely legal. His business partners, who had once treated him with respect and deference, now looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. The sale of Thompson Industries to my shell corporation was completed within weeks, and I immediately began implementing changes that David had been too arrogant to consider. The company's profits increased by 30% in the first quarter under my leadership, proving that the simple housewife had a better understanding of business strategy than the man who had spent decades claiming credit for success. Jennifer's fate was particularly satisfying. The evidence of her embezzlement was turned over to federal prosecutors, and she was arrested at her apartment while packing to flee the country. The money she had stolen was recovered and returned to the company, but her career and reputation were destroyed forever. But it was my children's reactions that provided the most complex emotions for me. Sarah, who had always been the most vocal in her dismissal of my intelligence, was forced to drop out of her expensive private college when David could no longer afford the tuition. She came to me, tears streaming down her face, begging for financial help. "Please, Mom," she sobbed. "I know we haven't always appreciated you, but you're still my mother. You can't let my future be destroyed because of Dad's mistakes." I looked at this young woman who had spent years treating me like an embarrassment. "Sarah," I said calmly, "for years you told me that I didn't understand the real world, that I had no valuable skills or knowledge. Now you want me to use the business acumen you claimed I didn't possess to solve your problems. Michael's response was pure anger and resentment. He blamed me for destroying the family, for being vindictive and cruel. "You're not the mother I thought I knew," he said, during one of our final conversations. I smiled at him sadly and replied, "You're absolutely right. The mother you thought you knew was a fiction, a role I played while sacrificing my own identity for your happiness." The most difficult part of my victory was confronting my own role in what had happened. I had allowed myself to become invisible, had enabled their treatment of me by accepting it without consequences. But I also realized that my response was not just about revenge, it was about justice. It was about proving that actions have consequences, that treating people cruelly will eventually cost you everything. David's final plea came 6 months after the divorce was finalized. He had lost his house, his business, his girlfriend, and most of his friends. He called me one evening, his voice broken and desperate. "Margaret," he said, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I understand now what I lost. Is there any chance we could try again?" I listened to his words, feeling a mixture of sadness and satisfaction. "David," I replied, "you didn't lose me because you made a mistake. You lost me because you spent years systematically destroying my self-worth, dismissing my contributions, and treating me like I was worthless. That's not something that can be fixed with an apology." The woman who had once begged for scraps of affection and recognition was gone forever. In her place stood someone who knew her own worth, who demanded respect rather than hoping for it, and who would never again allow anyone to make her feel invisible or insignificant. 2 years have passed since the day I revealed the truth about who I really was, and as I sit in my new office, the corner suite of the building that houses the company I now own, I find myself reflecting on the journey that brought me here. The transformation has been as challenging as it has been liberating. The immediate aftermath of my revenge was intoxicating, but as the dust settled, I found myself facing an unexpected challenge, learning to live with the consequences of my own success. The guilt came first, creeping in during quiet moments when the satisfaction of victory faded and I was left with the reality of what I had done. I sought therapy, something the old Margaret would never have considered. Dr. Elizabeth Chen became my guide through the complex emotions of my transformation, helping me understand that feeling guilty about protecting myself was just another form of the self-diminishment I had practiced for decades. "You didn't destroy your family," she told me. "You revealed the truth about what your family had already become." The business world embraced me with enthusiasm. The story of the housewife who had outmaneuvered her successful husband became legendary, and I found myself invited to speak at conferences and consulted by other women facing similar situations. Thompson Industries, under my leadership, became more profitable than it had ever been under David's management. The children's reactions to my transformation varied dramatically. Sarah, after the initial shock and anger, began to show a grudging respect for what I had accomplished. She transferred to a state school, took out student loans, and worked part-time. Experiences that taught her lessons about independence her privileged upbringing had never provided. "I understand now why you did it," she told me during one of our monthly lunches. "I still think you could have found a way that didn't hurt us so much, but I understand that we gave you no choice. We treated you terribly, and we never even realized we were doing it." Michael remained angry longer, but eventually called to apologize, his voice thick with tears. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry we made you feel like you didn't matter. I'm sorry it took losing everything for us to see what we had done." Through speaking engagements and business networking, I met dozens of women who had similar stories. We formed an informal support network, sharing strategies for reclaiming power and rebuilding identities. Together with Patricia Williams, another woman with a similar story, I started Phoenix Rising Consulting, a firm that specialized in helping women navigate complex financial situations during major life transitions. The relationship with David evolved in ways I never expected. After the initial bitterness, we gradually developed a kind of respectful distance. His apology, when it finally came, was sincere and complete. But it was also too late. The woman who had once desperately wanted his love and respect no longer needed either. As I look toward the future now, I see possibilities that the old Margaret could never have imagined. I am no longer just a housewife or just a businesswoman. I am a complete person who contains multitudes, who can be loving and fierce, nurturing and strategic, gentle and powerful. To the women who might be reading this, who might be living in the shadows of their own lives, accepting cruelty as the price of love, I want you to know, you are more than they tell you. You are stronger than they want you to believe. Don't wait for permission to be powerful. Don't wait for recognition to know your worth. My name is Margaret Thompson, and I am no longer just anything. I am everything I was meant to be, and that more than any revenge, more than any success, is the greatest triumph of all.